I will tell you that my concerns with this bill are both in process and in content.
I'm sorry, your time has expired.
I will tell you that my concerns with this bill are both in process and in content.
Senator Housakos.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Colleagues, I would like to start by thanking many of you for recognizing the need for and engaging in thorough review of this legislation rather than expediting it, as the government had hoped that we would have done. And yes, that was the desire of the government, not just the Bloc or the NDP. That was quite evident in a comment from Minister Guilbeault's Chief of Staff a couple of weeks ago, before we had received this bill, when she stated to the National Post that they, the government, expected this legislation to pass in the House and the Senate before we adjourn for the summer. As I said at that time, it takes a certain level of arrogance to make such a statement. Or the NDP. That came from the government. And that desire to see at all costs this legislation pass was certainly evident in the procedural path it followed through the House of Commons, particularly at committee. It was, at least in my opinion, and that of numerous observers who were well-versed in Westminster Parliament and parliamentary democracy, an absolute affront to parliamentary practice and procedure. It did not serve the institution well, nor did it serve this legislation well. It is not a path that we as parliamentarians should aspire to follow in this chamber or even, again, in the other. We certainly can't control or even attempt to control what happens in the House any more than they can or should attempt to control what happens here. We can only control how we conduct our business. This bill is concerned, we should do so in a manner divorced from politics and electoral considerations to which it was subject to in the House of Commons. We must conduct our review in a robust manner with a focus on good policy and governance rather than on good politics. And that appears to be what's happening based on the debate that has taken place thus far.
Lead people for some other purpose.
Damn right, there's a lot of misleading going on, and I think said person is one of them. What do you think? Leave your comments below. Check out Mr.
There
Guy.
is simply no debating that by removing Section 4.1, the bill now applies to user-generated content, since all audio-visual content is treated as a program under the Act. You've heard experts say that, and department officials say that. The attempts to deflect from that simple reality by pointing to Section 2.1 to argue that users are not regulated is deceptive and does not speak to the issue of regulating the content of users. I'll speak to freedom of expression implications in a moment, but want to pause to note that no one, literally no other country, uses broadcast regulation to regulate user-generated content in this way.
Respect to my colleague and friend Senator Dawson, the sponsor of this bill, it does not do what the government claims it does. Again, with respect, Senator Dawson's speech last week was an oversimplification of both C10's intent and its consequences. I would like to thank our colleagues who engaged in last week's debate, but in particular, I would like to thank Senator Simons because I think she did an excellent job of breaking down what this bill is meant to do versus what it actually does. And I certainly will be touching on many of those same issues. I'll start with the overarching goal of this legislation. This legislation misses the mark entirely. In short, Senator Dawson and the Trudeau government characterized this legislation as leveling the playing field between big tech, foreign streaming companies, and Canada's traditional broadcasters. They also describe it as a means to protect Canadian talent, and in particular minority voices like Indigenous, LGBTQ+, and in the case of Quebec, to protect and promote the French language and Francophone culture. It sounds great, but it is, as I said, an oversimplification of not only the legislation, but also the problem it supposedly seeks to remedy. The core problem with this bill is that it takes the regulatory tools designated for a small, fixed number of licensed TV and radio stations in the 1990s and attempts to apply it to the vast universe of Internet in the 2020s. In so doing, it gives the CRTC an unprecedented delegation of power with no clear framework or definitions as how it will be used. Just take the main mechanism this bill creates, the new category of online undertakings, which will now have to be registered and regulated as broadcasters. Bill C-10 defines them as undertakings for the transmission or retransmission of programs over the Internet for reception by the public by means of broadcasting receiving apparatus. This definition is so vague that it could include everything from Amazon Prime to anyone with a website and a podcast. Programs under the Broadcasting Act are defined to include images and sounds or some combination of them in which written text is not predominant. This could mean videos, podcasts, photos, and memes, and could include everything from a $100 million film produced by Netflix to a 15-second video on TikTok. As for the problem this legislation supposedly seeks to remedy, the government continues to frame the current landscape as one where big foreign streaming companies are gobbling up the poor little Canadian broadcasters, and Canadian talent are suffering as a result. And by golly, the government is here to save the day. And to save us, because they're going to make these big, bad streamers pay their fair share, and Canadians will reap the rewards, especially Canadian talent and producers. Even with today's technical briefing, the government draws a parallel between declining revenues for traditional radio and television and increased revenues for large foreign streaming companies, and states that the level of support for Canadian content and Canadian artists is negatively impacted as a result. And they claim, in the simplest of terms, that C-10 will correct that imbalance and spread the wealth. And sorry, colleagues, but that's just not accurate representation of the issue or the facts.